Okay, so we want to add some pockets to this Knitter's Dude cardigan, and we're going to do that with an Afterthought pocket. And an Afterthought pocket is going to sit on the inside of our garment. So what we've knitted on the front is going to be the outside front of the pocket, and that way we don't interrupt any of our color work or anything like that. Now, I have made just some little cotton linings to go on the inside of my pocket. I've never done this before, so I'm hoping that it'll give it just a little bit more stability, keep things from poking through the knitting. But in any case, they're very helpful for me to decide where I want to put my pocket. So I pretty much just lined up the bottom here with kind of where the ribbing starts along the bottom of the cardigan. And I've used 2 stitch markers just to mark kind of the width of the pocket, and this just happens to be 28 stitches. I've counted that out, and I'll do the same for the pocket on the other side of the cardigan. So once we kind of have that worked out, we're going to need a few things. I'll just get that lining out of the way for now. So we're going to need some needles to pick up our stitches. We're also going to want a stitch holder. This is going to hold on to half of the stitches. I usually work the back of the pocket and keep the front on hold, and so this is going to hold on to the stitches that are still going to be visible at the front and outside of our pocket. I usually do that last, so put those on hold. And then we're going to also need just a pair of snips or scissors. We're going to cut into the netting here to make the opening for the pocket. So the first thing to do, this works just like the Afterthought heel method if you've ever done that with socks. So once we've worked out where we want to put our pocket, and bearing in mind that the top of your pocket, sort of where the opening would be, you need a few kind of rows of height there. There's a few different ways that you can do this top. You could put an I-cord bind off on it. You can do a few rows of ribbing and bind it off. You could double knit it. Really, you just want to use, you could do garter as well. You just want to use a method that isn't going to curl. I think that I might use the double knitting method for this one because I want the top of the pocket to blend into this lighter blue stripe in the cardigan. But of course we don't want it to curl, so that's why I'm going to double knit it. First thing to do then, once we've determined where our pocket is going, is we're going to pick up the stitches across in between our markers here. Now I want the pocket probably to start at about here so that I have about 5 or 6 rows that I can knit kind of the top of the pocket band, if you will. Now I'm going to pick up where I want that to start is going to be here. I'm going to pick up the right leg of each stitch, each of these 28 stitches going across in between these markers. I'll maybe zoom this in a little bit so you can see a little bit better. This is kind of the 3rd row from the start of this stripe, so I'm just going to make sure that I'm picking up in the same row as I go across. Okay, so I've picked up 28 stitches across there. That's the width of my pocket. And they're on the needles. Now I'm going to pick up the same number of stitches across, 2 rows below the one that I just picked up, and they're going to go on my stitch holder here. Okay, so that's all the bottom row on my stitch holder. Now you can of course use a spare set of needles here if you don't have a stitch holder. You could pick them up on some needles and throw them on a barber cord if that would be less cumbersome for you. But once we've got kind of these 2 rows picked up, and I should mention too, the needle that I use to pick up those stitches is smaller than the needle that I knit the cardigan with, and that's just because it's easier to get a smaller needle into the stitches. I am going to be switching back to the 4.5mm needle that I used to knit the fabric of this cardigan so that they match. And now the next part, this is a bit that always scares people a little bit. We're going to cut a single stitch in the center of that row that is in between the 2 rows we've picked up the stitches on. So very carefully, I always put my hand in underneath to make sure we're not cutting through anything else in here. And I kind of like to just use the tip of the needle to sort of poke out one of those strands. Just make sure we're getting the right one and that we're not going to cut anything we don't want to cut. We're just going to snip the one stitch. It's very important. You don't want to cut the whole way across because now we're going to unpick that row, and you want to have the tails, as we unravel this, you want to have enough of that tail left over that you can weave it in so that the rest of that row doesn't continue to unravel. If you don't have enough of a tail to weave in there, it's just going to keep going on you. Okay, so that's our pocket open now. So we've got a hole. We're going to be able to get our hands in there. And we have about 6 or 7 inches of yarn from the row that we unpicked kind of on either side that we will weave those tails in later to make sure everything's nice and secure. Okay, so I've just flipped this over to the back of the cardigan. This is the bottom ribbing here, so we're getting it in that direction. I've got my gauge size needle ready to go, and I've also counted how many rows it is from where the top of my pocket and where the bottom of the pocket need to meet. So I wanted to put the bottom of the pocket just right above the ribbing here, so the distance from here to here, that's 40 rows. So that's what I'm going to knit. And then when I get to the bottom here, I'm going to fasten the bottom of the pocket to the jumper, I think, as I bind it off. You can just use a regular bind off and then sew it down. And we're also going to sew down the sides. So when I'm attaching my new yarn here for the pocket, I'm going to leave myself a nice generous tail of about 12 inches should be enough to seam up. I want enough to seam up that one side of the pocket. After the pocket is bound off, I'll leave myself another tail here to come back and seam the other side of the pocket up this way. And then that way, everything will be sewn down and the ends will kind of all be woven in at the same time. So here we go. Just gonna leave that around and start knitting. And I will meet you guys back here when I am done knitting my 40 rows of stockinette, and I'll show you how I attach the pocket to the bottom of the pocket to the cardigan there. Okay, so now that I've finished knitting the length of the back of the pocket here, we need to fasten it to the front of the cardigan, and I'm planning to do this just right above the ribbing. A few different ways you can do this. As I mentioned before, you could just bind off the bottom of your pocket as normal and then sew it down. But I am actually going to use a 3-needle bind off here. You could also do a Kitchener stitch or sew and bind off and just kind of sew it directly to the cardigan as you bind it off. So I've just used that other spare needle to pick up the 28 stitches and making sure that they start and end in the corresponding columns that we started with. And I've just put them on the spare needle just so that they're kind of ready to go. I've just picked them all up rather than picking them one up at a time during the bind off. I just like to have them all ready to go. So I'm simply going to insert my needle through the stitch on the front needle that is holding the pocket back, as well as this needle at the back, which is the front of the cardigan, holding on to the bottom of the stitches next to my ribbing. So I'm simply just going to knit those 2 stitches together, them off, knit the next 2 together, and then pass the first stitch over the second to bind it off. And I'm going to continue doing that across the row. This is partly because I kind of avoid sewing knitted garments at all costs. It's not my favorite bit, so I just kind of think if I can get the bind off and get this connected all in one go, it saves me sewing up. And I am just trying to keep this bind off reasonably loose. I don't want to pull on it too tight because first of all, I don't want to distort those stitches that we picked up near the ribbing. If it's too tight, it'll pull those in and pucker. We definitely don't want any puckering, but we do still want it to have a little bit of the stretch that the knitted fabric would kind of naturally have as well. So I'm trying to maintain that. It's got a little give there. It's not a ton. It's giving good structure to the bottom of the pocket, but it is still flexible enough that it's going to stretch with the rest of the garment. Okay, that's the last stitch there. And I'll just pull my working yarn through. Okay, so now we will need to leave enough of a tail that we can use it to seam up this side of the pocket. The tail that we had at the other end will seam up that side of the pocket from where we started. It's a bit of a tangle here. Yeah, I reckon you probably need again about 12 to 14 inches, but I'm going to be really generous with this because I would always rather have too much than not enough. Okay, so I've just turned this around so that I can sew my pocket from the bottom up. I just find it easier to mattress stitch that way. I have also just taken a bit of scrap yarn here, this bright green, and just run a basting stitch. This is through the center of the column of the 29th stitch in the row, or the pocket. This was across as 28, so this basting stitch, I've just put one stitch to the outside of where I want the seam to go, and that's because I'm not going to sew into the same column. I'm going to sew into the one next to it. I actually prefer to mattress stitch in these instances kind of in the little bump that would be in between the 28th and the 29th column, and I just find that pulls less on the front fabric than if you were to pick up the thread from the actual stitch column. So I've got my darning needle threaded up with my tail here, and I'm going to start, pull that green apart so I can find the column. So that is a stitch column, that is a stitch column. This is the little bump that's in between the two. So it's probably a little bit difficult to see. I'm trying to get that a little bit closer for you guys. So my green yarn is running up the middle of this column. I want to pick up the little purl bump that is just next to that column. So I'm going to start here. And then I'm going to come back across and same thing, find that next little bump on the back of our pocket that is in between the stitches. And follow the next one up, and I'm just going to use that green yarn as my guide to make sure that I am seaming this up in a straight line. Okay. All right, so that is all sewn up the top of the pocket there. It's nice and straight. I'm actually just going to go ahead and, well, actually, I'll show you the other side first. Okay. So from the front there, again, you can see there's just a tiny little bit of distortion there. Honestly, too, like when we get this jumper blocked, that's going to flatten out a bit as well. So we're just going to do the other side, and then I will come back and show you how to do the little top band on the top of the pocket. Okay, let's look at finishing off the top of these pockets. So I've finished the one on this side. So I've opted for a double knit band of about 4 rows here. Now, couple of things about doing your top band. So we've discussed a couple of different methods that you can use. And one thing that I would recommend, however, is that you consider going down a needle size for this little section. So before, when I did the back, I was using the same needle, 4.5, that I had used for the main body of the cardigan. But I did go down a needle size here to do my button band. Now, one reason for that is because if you do the same size, they tend to be kind of really loose up here, even though I've gone down a size here. It's still quite open, and obviously we want it loose enough that we can get our hands and whatnot in our pockets. We don't want to be struggling to do that. But we do still want it to be neat and not gaping. So I've gone down a needle size here, and I've also, because this is double knit, and because I want to reduce some of that bulk, and because double knitting with 2 strands of yarn on a smaller size needle would make this bit of the fabric quite dense, what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to go down a needle size, and I'm also only going to use a single strand of my yarn here. So this whole jumper, all the ways I've been holding 2 strands of 4-ply yarn double. So just for this top little bit, I am going to hold the yarn just 1 strand, and that will kind of keep this from getting too dense and too bulky. So first step here, let's go ahead and take the stitches off our holder, put them back onto our needle. Okay. You can also remove these markers now if they're still marking your pocket space. We don't need them anymore. Okay, now, so I have my 28 stitches across, and in order to do my double knit band, I need to double the amount of stitches that are here. So this first row across, what I'm going to do is I'm going to knit into the front and back of each stitch. Just get that on there. Okay, so knit the front and the back, and I'm not going to worry too much about leaving too long of a tail here, so we will have a bit of kind of fabric to 2 ways you can do this. You can either sew it down at the end, in which case I would leave at least a little tail, but what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to catch a stitch as I work up the ways, just at the edge here where it would be sewn down, and knit 2 together at the end, or rather the beginning of each row, and you'll see what I mean by that when we work a bit further. But for now, let's just focus on getting the right number of stitches on the needle here. So knit front and back the whole way across, and that'll give me 56 stitches total. Okay, here's the last few, front and back. Okay, so there's all our stitches on. Now I am also going, so that last stitch, even though it was a knit front and back, I'm just going to keep the yarn kind of at the front here for a moment, and I'm going to pick up this leg of the stitch in the next column. I'm going to just use this leg here in order to secure the sides of my little band here, so I don't have to sew it down in the end. So that's the stitch I'm going to use. Now I'm going to turn my work, and I'm going to knit that one that I picked up together with the first stitch of the row, and that'll secure the edge. Now this looks a little bit loosey-goosey here. There's a bit of a hole here, and that is attached to our tail from when we took that sort of center row out when we first cut into our pocket. So I'm just going to give that a little tug for now, but we will weave that in properly later, so don't worry if it keeps kind of getting a bit loose on you. Okay, so to establish the double knitting pattern now, so we're going to knit the first stitch of the row, then bring the yarn forward and slip the next as if to purl. Bring the yarn to the back again, knit the next stitch. Bring the yarn forward, slip as if to purl, bring the yarn to the back, and knit the next stitch. And we're going to alternate this the whole way across the row. Okay, so I've just got to the end of that row and I'm ready to turn the work again. Just get our tails out of the way. Okay, and when I'm starting this next row again, so that on the row I just finished, we ended on a slip one. So the yarn will be in the back. I'm going to knit this one, the first stitch. I'm going to find like that column next to it, and I'm going to knit those together. Okay, bring the yarn to the front, slip the next stitch, yarn to the back, knit, yarn to the front, slip, and just keep alternating that. So all of the stitches that were slipped on the last row are getting worked on this row. And essentially what this is doing is it's creating 2 layers of stockinette fabric with closed ends that we're working at the same time. And so this won't curl at the top of our pocket, and it's gonna blend in relatively seamlessly with the rest of the garment design. And it'll just be a lovely finish. So I'm gonna go ahead and knit a few more rows of this until it'll be about 4 rows tall on each side. So that's 8 rows total. So I'm going to finish that off and then I'll show you how to bind this off. Okay, so I've got my band here to the height that I want it. It's 4 rows on each side, so 8 rows total back and forth. And I'm going to use the tubular bind off. This is a pretty common bind off for ribbing as well. It would work here too. So you need a length about 3 times the width of whatever you are binding off, plus a little extra. I always like to have just a little bit of extra to make sure there is plenty of length to properly weave in the tail. Okay. Now I'm going to add in one little extra step. So because I was kind of seaming up the side of the little band as I was going here, and my yarn is still in the back because that last stitch was the slip one on the previous row. I'm just going to make sure that before I set up my tubular bind off, I'm actually going to come in this side and grab that leg. Would have been the one that I had knitted two together if I was carrying on making this longer. So that's just going to secure the side little corner of our band here. So that one and this one are going to come together in a moment here. So to start, I'm going to go into the first stitch knitwise, take that one off the needle, and then I'm going to, oops, sorry, we'll just focus this a bit here again. I'm going to skip this next stitch, and I'm going to go into the second one purlwise. Okay, now we're going to come back to this one that's on the first one that's now on the needle. We're going to go into there purlwise and take him off as well. Then we're going to skip this one. We need to come into this second one, but our yarn is in the back, so we need to actually come from the back. We're just going to come in between the two stitches to get this yarn to the front, and then into that second stitch knitwise. Okay. Now back to this one. Now you might start kind of realizing, so this one presents knitways. This is a stitch of knit columns. This is a stitch of knit columns. Every other one is going to have, I just pull this apart a little bit, you might be able to see there's a little purl bump there on that second stitch. Sorry for the focusing. So just like, it's really similar to Kitchener actually, just that everything is on one needle. So we're always going to be taking our knit stitches off the needle knitwise and then setting up the next knitwise presenting stitch. So skip this one, go into this one purlwise. And then our first stitch on here, present the purlwise. We're going to go into him purlwise, take him off, and then coming from the back toward the front, we're going to go knitwise into this next purl stitch. You can kind of do this in one motion. There we go. Now the next one comes off knitwise into the second one purlwise, then off purlwise into the second one knitwise. We're just going to keep working that across the row. Yarn is getting caught here. And you want to try to keep your tension fairly even here as well, particularly when you're coming across to go purlwise into this next knit presenting stitch. You don't want this little bit of yarn that's going across to get too tight, so just be wary that you're not pulling it really tight. And like with anything with tension, that probably will just take some practice, so if it feels a little bit off to you, you can always take it out and try again. Okay, I'm going to finish this up and I will show you the result at the end. Okay, just wanted to show one more thing here. I'm just coming to the end of the last stitch here that I'm going to bind off. So going into this one purlwise, And then also the next stitch up in our columns here, just to secure that side of the band. And I'll bring that through to the back of the work. And all that's left to do will be to weave in all of our tails. And block this jumper. And then after I have the jumper blocked, I will sew in my little pocket linings. Okay, this is one side and the other. They do look a little bit wonky here. This is a little bit loose, but with blocking, everything will sort of flatten itself out.